The North Atlantic, January 17, 1940. 3:47 a.m. The sea is black glass, heaving slowly beneath a sky choked with stars. No moon. The kind of darkness submariners pray for. Aboard the German U-boat U-27, Oberleutnant Johannes Franz stands in the conning tower, his breath crystallizing in the frozen air. The diesel engines thrum beneath his boots, a predator's heartbeat.
Before we continue, if you want more incredible and untold stories, make sure to hit the subscribe button and tell us which country you're watching from.
Through his Zeiss binoculars, he scans the horizon for the silhouettes of British merchant ships, fat with Canadian grain and American steel. The hunting has been good these past 6 weeks, 4 freighters sent to the bottom. 17,000 tons of Allied supplies transformed into twisted metal coffins, spinning slowly toward the ocean floor. Franz lowers his binoculars and allows himself a thin smile. The British are frightened. They travel in convoys now, huddled together like sheep, their destroyers racing back and forth in predictable patterns. He has studied these patterns. He knows their weakness. The U-boat Corps calls it Rudeltaktik, wolfpack tactics. But Franz hunts alone tonight, and he prefers it that way. Solitary, patient, lethal. What Franz does not know, what he cannot know in this moment, is that 8 kilometers to the northwest, another captain is also awake, also watching, also waiting. But this captain is not patient. This captain is not calculating. This captain, Commander Gordon Campbell of His Majesty's Royal Navy, is something the German submarine service has not yet encountered in this young war. He is utterly, gloriously, catastrophically insane. The war is 4 months old. Europe has already learned to hold its breath. Poland lies crushed beneath the treads of panzer divisions, her cities smoldering, her government scattered to the winds of exile. France crouches behind the Maginot Line, waiting. Britain counts her merchant ships like a miser counts coins, knowing that each one lost brings the island nation closer to starvation. And in the Atlantic, that vast, cold battlefield without trenches or flags, the U-boats are winning. Germany's submarine fleet enters 1940 with confidence bordering on arrogance. They have reason for it. In the Great War, just 20 years prior, U-boats nearly strangled Britain into submission, sinking over 11 million tons of Allied shipping. Now, equipped with improved torpedoes, longer range, and the hard lessons of that earlier conflict, they are even more deadly. Each U-boat captain studies the same tactical manual: remain submerged during daylight, surface at night to recharge batteries and hunt, strike without warning, dive before the escorts can respond. It is a formula that works with mathematical precision. British anti-submarine warfare in early 1940 is, to put it charitably, inadequate. Sonar, the new underwater detection technology the Royal Navy calls ASDIC, is temperamental and easily fooled. Depth charges sink slowly and explode late. Escort vessels are too few, spread too thin across convoy routes that span thousands of miles. The Admiralty has calculated that for every U-boat sunk, 16 Allied ships go down. The mathematics of annihilation. But mathematics does not account for men like Gordon Campbell. Campbell is 47 years old in January 1940, which makes him ancient by the standards of active sea command. His face is weathered oak, creased by 30 decades of salt wind and responsibility. He earned his Victoria Cross, Britain's highest military honor, in 1917, commanding a Q-ship called HMS Farnborough. Q-ships were the Royal Navy's answer to U-boat supremacy, merchant vessels disguised with hidden weapons, deliberately offering themselves as bait. When a U-boat surfaced to sink what appeared to be a helpless freighter, the Q-ship would drop its disguise and open fire at point-blank range. 11 U-boats fell to Q-ships during the Great War. Campbell personally accounted for 3 of them. The tactic required a particular kind of courage, or madness. A Q ship's crew had to allow torpedoes to strike their own vessel, had to absorb casualties, had to sell the illusion of panic and defeat while secretly manning guns and waiting for the perfect moment to strike back. Campbell became legendary for it. Stories circulated in the fleet about the time he calmly smoked his pipe on deck while his ship burned and German submariners watched through periscopes, convinced they'd made a kill. Only when the U-boats surfaced to confirm the wreck did the gunners emerge and blow it apart with weapons that shouldn't have existed. The Admiralty retired Campbell after the Great War with full honors and a comfortable pension. He might have spent 1940 in a country house, tending roses and boring dinner guests with old stories. Instead, when Hitler's panzers rolled into Poland, Campbell showed up at Admiralty House in London and requested immediate reinstatement. They tried to refuse. He was too old. The war had changed. Q ships were obsolete. U-boats no longer surfaced to finish off cripples. They simply fired another torpedo from safe distance. Campbell listened politely to these objections, then pointed out that the Royal Navy was losing ships at an unsustainable rate and couldn't afford to dismiss any idea, no matter how outdated or crazy. The Admiralty, desperate and privately terrified, gave him a ship. Not a Q ship this time. Those were indeed obsolete. Instead, they gave him HMS Dunraven, a modified anti-submarine trawler, small, slow, armed with a single 4-inch gun and a handful of depth charges, the kind of vessel that in rational warfare would simply escort convoys and hope not to encounter anything dangerous. But Campbell didn't request escort duty. He requested something the Admiralty had never tried before: permission to hunt U-boats using ramming tactics.
The proposal was received with silence in the conference room, then laughter, then anger. Ramming a submarine required closing to zero distance, suicidal in an age of torpedo warfare. It meant abandoning every tactical advantage, deliberately positioning your vessel as an unmissable target. It violated every principle of modern naval combat. One admiral called it the tactical equivalent of charging a machine gun nest with a cavalry saber. Campbell's response entered naval legend: "Then I shall be the last cavalry charge." They gave him the ship. What the German submariners expected in January 1940 was predictable: British escorts that maintained safe distances, depth charges that rarely hit, convoys that scattered in panic. They expected patterns, protocols, rational tactical responses. They had been trained at Kiel and Wilhelmshaven by instructors who emphasized the U-boat's fundamental invincibility when properly handled. The submerged submarine was untouchable, a ghost in the water, the apex predator of the Atlantic. What they encountered instead on the night of January 17th was Gordon Campbell doing 19 knots directly toward the source of a periscope wake, with his engines at emergency full and every man on deck screaming like Vikings. U-27 spots HMS Dunraven at 4:11 a.m., framed against the slightly lighter eastern horizon. Through the periscope, Franz identifies it as a small escort trawler, alone, off the convoy route, possibly a straggler, possibly conducting a search pattern. No matter, she is well within torpedo range. Franz orders his crew to battle stations, confirms the firing solution, and prepares to add a 5th kill to his patrol record. Standard procedure calls for the U-boat to fire at a range of 1 to 2 kilometers, close enough for accuracy, far enough to evade counterattack. Franz's torpedo officer suggests exactly this, but Franz, confident and perhaps slightly bored with shooting helpless merchants, decides to close to 800 meters. He wants to be certain. He wants to watch this one die. Through the periscope, he sees the trawler maintaining course and speed. No indication they've spotted the periscope. Perfect. Franz allows himself another smile. The torpedo doors are open. The weapons are armed. The crew waits for his order with the mechanical efficiency that makes the U-boat fleet so deadly. And then the trawler turns. Not a gradual course correction, not an evasive maneuver, a hard, violent turn directly toward U-27's position, and suddenly the trawler's speed is increasing, her bow wave growing, whitewater spreading like wings as she accelerates. Franz's first thought is that she's making a random depth charge run. Escorts sometimes did this blindly, hoping to luck into a contact. But there's nothing random about this. The trawler's bearing is exact, precise, locked on to the U-boat's position as if she can see through the dark water. "Sir?" The torpedo officer's voice carries the first edge of concern. Franz watches through the periscope. The trawler is still accelerating, 600 meters now. Her bow is aimed like a spear point, and Franz realizes, with the cold clarity that separates competent officers from dead ones, that she's not going to turn. She's going to ram. The order dies in his throat. It is impossible. No escort vessel deliberately rams a submarine. The tactic is antique, something from the age of sail, before torpedoes made close combat suicide. The trawler will turn at the last moment. She must turn. All of Franz's training, all of the tactical doctrine, all of the rational assumptions about how the British fight, everything says she will turn. 400 meters, 300. HMS Dunraven does not turn. Franz screams the order to dive, emergency dive, all ballast tanks blown. But U-boats are not swift when submerging from periscope depth. They need 30 seconds, 45 seconds, time that must be purchased from an enemy obliging enough to maintain distance. Campbell's trawler covers the final 200 meters in less than 20 seconds. Campbell himself stands on the open bridge, hands welded to the rail, eyes fixed on the periscope wake. His executive officer, Lieutenant Harris, stands beside him, reciting distance estimates in a voice gone high and strange with adrenaline. The deck crew, men Campbell personally selected for this insanity, brace themselves against rails and rigging, watching the ocean ahead with the fixed stares of men approaching a cliff edge. At 100 meters, the periscope vanishes as U-27 begins her emergency dive. Campbell doesn't slow. Somewhere below the surface, the submarine is angling down, her bow dropping, her crew clinging to anything bolted down as the boat tilts toward the safety of deep water. But she needs 30 seconds to reach diving depth.
Campbell gives her 18. The collision at 4:14 a.m. is not the broadside strike Campbell hoped for. That would have broken the submarine's back, snapped her pressure hull like a dry branch. Instead, Dunraven's reinforced bow catches U-27 at a glancing angle along her starboard side, just aft of the conning tower. The impact sounds like God slamming a door, a monstrous metallic shriek followed by the scream of tearing steel. Dunraven shudders, her entire frame convulsing, her forward momentum arrested as if she struck a reef. Men tumble across the deck. Campbell's ribs slam into the bridge rail hard enough to crack bone, but he doesn't release his grip, doesn't look away. Below, inside U-27, the world becomes chaos. The collision throws men against bulkheads, smashes instruments, ruptures seals. The pressure hull holds, barely, but the external ballast tanks are crushed, flooding asymmetrically, and the boat immediately begins listing 15 degrees to starboard. Electrical systems short out in showers of sparks. The emergency lighting flickers, dies, returns in sickly red. Someone is screaming in the aft torpedo room, a sound that stops abruptly, which is somehow worse than if it had continued. Franz pulls himself up from the deck where the impact threw him. Blood streams from his scalp. He doesn't remember hitting anything. The boat is listing badly, and he can hear water, the distinctive high-pressure hiss of seawater entering spaces that should be dry. Damage reports flood in over the intercom. Starboard ballast tanks compromised, outer hull breached in 3 places, depth gauge inoperative, main motor mounts damaged. The submarine is hurt, badly hurt, but she's still diving, still fighting for the protective darkness of deep water. Campbell watches the surface, waiting. His bow is stove in, crumpled like foil, taking water.
The ship's carpenter is already below, shouting orders, men working pumps, but Campbell ignores all of this. He watches the ocean, searching for oil, for bubbles, for any sign of what his strike accomplished. There, 20 meters off the starboard beam, a swirl of darker water, thick and viscous, spreading like a bruise. Oil. The submarine is bleeding. "Mark that position," Campbell orders, his voice perfectly calm despite the fractured rib grinding in his chest. "Prepare depth charge pattern Baker 3. "Sir, we don't have active ASDIC contact. She could be anywhere below us." "She's hurt," Campbell replies. "She'll surface. Just wait." This is the part where doctrine fails. The tactical manuals say that damaged submarines dive deep and limp away, hoping to outrun pursuit in the three-dimensional maze of the ocean depths. But Campbell knows something the manuals don't account for: terror. He knows what it's like to be inside a damaged vessel taking water, to hear the hull groaning under pressure, to watch depth gauges spinning toward numbers that mean death. He knows that fear makes men surface, even when their minds tell them it's suicide. U-27 makes it to 40 meters depth before her list becomes critical. The asymmetric flooding has put her in a situation every submariner dreads. The boat is angling toward a steepening dive she cannot arrest, her stern rising, her damaged bow pulling her down toward the crush depth where water pressure collapses steel like paper. Franz fights her with all the tricks his training provided: blow forward ballast, full reverse on the screws, angle the dive planes. But the submarine has passed the boundary between controlled descent and gravitational inevitability. At 53 meters, with the hull groaning like a wounded animal, Franz makes the decision that saves his crew and seals his fate as a prisoner of war. He orders an emergency surface. The submarine breaches like a wounded whale, her bow erupting from the Atlantic in a geyser of white water and diesel exhaust. She surfaces at a 20-degree angle, her conning tower streaming water, her deck canting drunkenly to starboard. Inside, the crew is already abandoning their stations, grabbing life vests, some of them crying, most of them simply blank with shock. They are 22 years old on average, boys from Hamburg and Munich and small farming villages whose names will never appear in history books. They joined the U-boat service because it offered higher pay and better rations than the surface fleet. They expected to be the hunters, the ghosts, the untouchable predators. They did not expect this. Campbell has his gun crews in position before U-27 fully breaches. The 4-inch gun, a weapon that would be laughably inadequate against a properly functioning submarine, opens fire at point-blank range. The first shell hits the base of the conning tower, shearing through the thin steel, killing the 2 men struggling through the hatch. The second shell misses, screaming past to splash harmlessly 200 meters beyond. The third shell strikes the forward deck, punching through and detonating somewhere inside the pressure hull. And that is the end of U-27. The submarine settles lower in the water, flooding through a dozen wounds, her bow sinking, her stern rising. Men spill from the hatches now, jumping into the Atlantic, their life vests bright orange against the black water. Campbell orders ceasefire and full stop. He will not kill men in the water. That is a line even this maddest of captains will not cross. Dunraven maneuvers alongside, and Campbell's crew throw lines and life rings, hauling German submariners from the freezing Atlantic, pulling them aboard like netted fish. Franz is the last man off U-27. He stands on the tilting deck as his boat goes under, watches her bow slip beneath the surface, watches the conning tower follow, watches the stern rise vertical for one absurd moment before it too vanishes into the Atlantic. The ocean swirls, foams, settles. The U-boat is gone. 22 minutes have passed since the collision. A British sailor throws Franz a line. He catches it, allows himself to be hauled aboard Dunraven, stands dripping on the enemy deck, and meets Campbell's eyes. Campbell is holding his ribs with one hand, his face gray with pain, but his expression is mild, almost friendly. "I am Oberlieutenant Johannes Franz, the
the German says in careful English, "I surrender my vessel and crew to your command." "Your vessel," Campbell replies, "is currently settling in 200 meters of water, but I accept your surrender nonetheless. Welcome aboard, Captain. We'll have you warm and fed shortly." Franz stares at him, at this gray-haired Englishman with his broken ribs and his casual courtesy, at this man who just committed the most lunatic act of naval warfare Franz has ever witnessed. "That was insane," Franz says. "You could have missed. We could have torpedoed you during the approach. A dozen things could have gone wrong."
Campbell considers this. Yes, he agrees, quite a lot of things could have gone wrong. But you see, Captain, they didn't. He gestures toward the spreading oil slick, the empty ocean where a U-boat was minutes before. This is the Atlantic. We don't have enough ships, enough weapons, enough time to fight you the way the manuals prescribe. So we do what works, even if it's crazy, especially if it's crazy, because you expect rational tactics, and that expectation is the only advantage we actually have. This is the moment, captured in Franz's post-war memoir and confirmed by 3 other U-27 survivors, when something shifted. Not just for Franz, but for the captured German submariners shivering under British blankets, drinking British tea laced with British rum, beginning to realize that they had not been sunk by superior technology or better training. They had been defeated by sheer, inexplicable audacity, by a man and crew willing to do something that made no sense, that violated all tactical doctrine, that shouldn't have worked, and yet did. The historical record grows complicated here, not because facts are sparse, but because what Campbell did became both famous and controversial. The Admiralty initially suppressed news of the ramming, fearing it would encourage reckless behavior among escort commanders who lacked Campbell's instincts and experience. But word leaked, as it always does. Within 6 weeks, British newspapers were calling him the Mad Ram of the Atlantic. German naval intelligence, reading intercepted British communications, initially dismissed the reports as propaganda. No one could be that foolish. Then U-27 failed to return from patrol, and her crew appeared in British POW camps, telling an impossible story that too many witnesses confirmed to ignore. Campbell conducted 3 more ramming attacks between January and May of 1940. One failed. The submarine detected his approach and dove in time, then escaped under cover of a rain squall. 2 succeeded. The light cruiser U-13 went down off the Hebrides on March 3rd. The mine layer U-19 was crippled in the North Sea on April 21st, though she managed to limp back to Germany and spent the rest of the war in dock as a training vessel. In total, Campbell's ramming tactics accounted for 3 confirmed U-boat kills, 1 probable, and 2 damaged. This may not sound like much. Against the backdrop of a war that would eventually see over 700 German U-boats sunk by all causes, 3 kills seems almost trivial. But numbers don't capture the psychological impact. German submarine doctrine in 1940 was built on a foundation of invulnerability, the conviction that a properly handled U-boat was untouchable, that escorts were nuisances to be avoided rather than threats to be feared. Campbell shattered that conviction. He proved that audacity could trump technology, that aggression could overcome firepower, that sometimes the craziest possible action was also the most effective. German tactical guidance was quietly revised in the spring of 1940. U-boat commanders were instructed to break off attacks if escort vessels showed signs of aggressive maneuvering. Maximum engagement ranges were increased. The predators had learned to fear. But there is a cost to being the last cavalry charge, a price paid in steel and flesh. HMS Dunraven survived her first ramming with a crushed bow and 2 fractured frames. She survived the second with her entire forward compartment flooded and 3 dead from the impact. The third ramming in April 1940 broke her back. The collision with U-19 struck at just the wrong angle, and Dunraven's keel snapped amidships. She stayed afloat long enough for Campbell to evacuate his crew, then slipped under in the cold North Sea, 40 miles off the English coast. Campbell himself suffered a fractured skull, 4 broken ribs, a ruptured spleen, and assorted internal injuries. He spent 5 months in hospital. The Admiralty, with palpable relief, declared him medically unfit for active service and retired him again. This time they made certain the retirement stuck. Campbell protested, naturally, but even he couldn't argue with doctors who could point to X-rays showing the considerable damage his tactics had inflicted on his own body. He spent the rest of the war training anti-submarine crews in Scotland, passing on his knowledge to younger officers who listened with the rapt attention students give to legends. After the war, he wrote a memoir that remains required reading at the Royal Naval College. He died in 1953, age 60, his battered body finally surrendering to injuries no man should have survived in the first place. The Times of London obituary called him the last of the Nelsonian captains, a man who would have felt perfectly at home at Trafalgar. There is a photograph taken in January 1940, 3 days after the sinking of U-27. It shows Campbell standing on the deck of Dunraven, his torso wrapped in bandages, his ship's bow visibly crumpled behind him. He is not smiling, not posing heroically. He simply looks tired, and perhaps a bit sad, as if he knows that what he has proven, that human courage can overcome mechanical odds, that audacity has its place even in modern warfare, will inspire men to do foolish, brave, terrible things. The photograph hangs in the Royal Navy Museum in Portsmouth, and submariners of a dozen nations have stood before it, trying to understand the man who was willing to turn his ship into a battering ram and himself into a projectile.
The symbolic object here is not a thing, but a direction. Forward. Always forward. Campbell's tactics allowed for no retreat, no hesitation, no second thoughts. Once committed, the ramming attack permitted no escape. You hit the target, or you died trying. There was no middle ground, no tactical withdrawal, no preserve forces for future battles calculation. It was the naval equivalent of burning your bridges, and in that finality lay both its madness and its effectiveness. The German submariners who survived encounters with Campbell never forgot that forward momentum, that sense of inexorability. They described in interrogation reports and post-war interviews the horror of watching an escort vessel bearing down like a runaway train, knowing that all their speed and maneuverability meant nothing if the hunter was willing to become the bullet. Several admitted that they had nightmares years after the war, dreams of periscope views showing a bow wave growing larger, impossibly large, and waking in cold sweat just before the impact. This, ultimately, was Campbell's genius. He weaponized inevitability. The U-boats were used to enemies who wanted to survive, who valued their ships and crews, who would break off attacks to preserve their vessels. Campbell didn't care about preservation. He cared about the kill. And that single-minded focus, that willingness to trade his ship for yours, his life for yours, created a calculus the Germans couldn't solve. How do you fight an enemy who's already accepted death as the entry price for engagement? You don't. You avoid them. You retreat. You become cautious. And in becoming cautious, you surrender the initiative, the aggression, the predator's confidence that made you dangerous in the first place. By May 1940, when German panzers were racing through France and the world's attention turned to land battles, the first phase of the Atlantic submarine war had already been decided, not by superior technology or numbers, but by the actions of a handful of men willing to do the stupidly brave thing at the exact moment it mattered most. Campbell was one such man. There were others, unnamed and unremembered, who made similar choices in different circumstances, but Campbell's ramming attacks crystallized something essential about how the outmatched British forces would fight this war, with improvisation, courage, and a willingness to embrace tactical insanity when rational methods failed. The epilogue writes itself in the cold mathematics of naval warfare. In the first 4 months of 1940, before Campbell's tactics became known, German U-boats sank an average of 47 Allied merchant ships per month with negligible losses. After April 1940, as Campbell's methods spread and were adapted by other commanders, that number dropped to 38 per month, then 32. Not because the British suddenly had more ships or better weapons, but because the Germans had learned caution, and caution is death to a predator. The U-boat fleet would have periods of resurgence, the happy time of 1941, the coordinated wolf packs of 1942, but never again would they possess the absolute confidence of those early months. Campbell had taught them that the prey might suddenly become the hunter, that the helpless merchant escort might turn into a battering ram, that assumptions about enemy behavior were assumptions that could kill you. There's a larger truth here, one that extends beyond naval tactics or submarine warfare. Freedom, genuine freedom, the kind worth defending, requires a willingness to do the unexpected, the irrational, the thing that makes no sense on paper but works in practice because no one believes you'll actually do it. Dictatorships are built on predictability, on populations that follow rules and defer to authority and do what they're told. Democracy is chaos, improvisation, the stubborn individual who looks at the tactical manual and says, "Yes, but what if we try this instead?" Campbell embodied that chaos. He was the opposite of the efficient German submarine machine with its precise protocols and calculated approaches. He was the wrench in the gears, the variable the equation couldn't account for, the madman who smiled politely and then drove his ship directly into yours because all the rational tactical options had already failed. On certain winter mornings in the North Atlantic, when the sea is black glass and the stars are hard points of frozen light, it is easy to imagine that somewhere in those depths, among the wrecks and the silence, Gordon Campbell is still there, gray-haired and smiling grimly, standing on the bridge of a ghost ship, calling for emergency flank speed, steering directly toward the thing that should not be challenged. The last cavalry charge again and again, forever, forward, because someone must be willing to be that crazy, that brave, that stupid. Because sometimes the only way to win is to refuse to lose, no matter what the manuals say, no matter what the odds calculate. And because, in the end, they didn't expect it. And that made all the difference.